Hey everybody, this is Mr. Robinson, and I'm going to walk you through the Unit 1 vocabulary, all right? We're going to start with the word we already did in class, which is bicameral legislature. In America, we have a bicameral legislature. It's a two-house legislature. Another word for legislature is Congress. That's what we say in America. England says Parliament. In America, we have a House of Representatives and a Senate, and they both have to agree to a law in order for it to go to the president's desk and get a signature. Next up is block grant and categorical grant. A block, or really when we talk about grants in this class, it's money that the federal government is giving to the states, okay? And the states are happy to get it, they're excited to get it. For example, like your school lunch being free might be from the federal government, or the Norco Bridge being rebuilt could be money from the federal government. States really like to give block grants. They like to receive block grants because it allows the state a lot of flexibility in how they spend it. So if California gets a block grant, maybe it's for transportation and they can make another carpool lane on the freeway, or they can fix the Hamner Bridge. But if they get a categorical grant, it's much more narrow, and they can only use it for the purpose that the states say, like this money is just for the school lunch program, where a block grant might be for all of education. You know what I mean? You see the difference? Block grant still will be like all of education, but that still means I can do it on lunch, I can do it on science, I can do it on reducing class sizes. A categorical grant is real specific, just on lunch. And so you need to know which one the federal government would rather give, categorical. Which one would states rather receive? Block grant. All right. The next up is centrists, and these are people, especially I think in this context, it's when the country was being started, sort of like Federalists in a way. And these are people that want the national government to be more powerful than the states, like California. Okay. Next up, I think is pretty clear. Hopefully you know this from 8th grade, 11th grade. It's checks and balances. Checks and balances are this idea that the president can't just like write a law and sign a law and make the law happen. We have a system in this country where the three branches, like a triangle, they can check each other's power. So laws have to come from Congress. They have to agree on them. They go to the president's desk. He or she can sign for the law to become, or really for the bill to become a law. And then our third branch, like the judges, they could strike that law down as unconstitutional. So what I'm trying to say is all the branches have a little bit of control over each other, and they can check each other's power. When you see the word clause in this class, it often means a sentence from the Constitution. It's like a legal document sentence, and in my class it means from the Constitution. So the Commerce Clause is a sentence in the Constitution, and it gives Congress the power to regulate or control commerce. And what commerce is like trade or money or business. So this is really broad, and this sentence has been used to expand the power of the federal government, actually more than any other sentence in the Constitution. That is a fun fact that you'll need to know for a test. So whether they are breaking up monopolies, like right now, Google is being investigated as a monopoly because they control like 95% of search traffic in America, and that seems to be too much. So breaking them up, how can the government do that? They can do it because they have the Commerce Clause in the Constitution that gives them permission. Or even keeping your medicine, from harming you, and having a Food and Drug Administration that can test your medicine to make sure it's safe is a good example of the Commerce Clause. Next up is a different type of power called concurrent powers. A concurrent power is just something that both the state of California has and the federal government has. So an example of that would be like police. Both California has put their own police, like sheriffs and Eastville police, and then the federal government has their own law enforcement too with the FBI. And that means it's a power that they both happen to have. The word confederation is whenever you have, this was our very first government really, was we had a confederation of states after the Declaration of Independence. And this confederation was a loose relationship between the states. It was almost like they were their own countries in a way. They had their own money and they had their own rules, and we were just kind of friends with each other. And this was our first government, and it was kind of a failure. We realized we needed a stronger federal government to keep us all tied together. Okay? The next word is decentralist, and this is the opposite of centralist. And this is those that favor having, like the state of California, being more powerful and having more authority than Washington, D.C. and the national government. We may have already talked about this in class, but the next word is direct democracy. Direct democracy is this idea that when people vote on things, we're just going to like follow the majority vote. And it's this idea that everybody has to vote on everything all the time. I like to imagine, you know that book you read, probably Lord of the Flies. You remember the boys, I don't remember how they get there, maybe a plane crash or something. Let's say their plane crashes and they're on an island and there's 30 boys. Direct democracy would be voting like, hey, should we build shelters next or should we hunt for food next? And the vote would determine what the boys are going to do, okay? In America, we don't have a direct democracy because we elect people who vote for us. Because if we did, it works on Lord of the Flies because there's 30 people, but if we did it this way, it would be inefficient. You'd have 330 million Americans voting on stuff all the time. And also the founding fathers did not trust us very much, and so they didn't want us to be voting on things. They would rather have like the brilliant minds that would go and vote on things. I'm going to jump down to the opposite word that might bug you of indirect democracy, and this is something that we do have in America. We're more often going to use the word republic, and what this means is that we have representatives and we voted for them. That's an important part of it. They've been voted on. We did get a say in who they were, but their job, 9 to 5, 365 days a year, will be voting on our laws so that we can be doctors and nurses and lawyers and not have to constantly be voting on stuff. All right, we got another clause of the Constitution, and this is the elastic clause, super important to this class. The elastic clause is also called the necessary and proper clause. And there's a sentence in the Constitution that says the government may do, or Congress may do, whatever is necessary and proper for the general welfare of the United States. And that is super broad. It's the most broad sentence in the Constitution, because sometimes we get in arguments as American citizens that say, like, should the government give us health care? Should the government pass laws about health care? Should the government like make me get car insurance? And a lot of times we say, well, what gives them the right to do that? And you can point a lot of times to the elastic clause, especially like with health care, and say, well, perhaps it's what's necessary and proper for the United States. Perhaps it's okay for them to do. So this is also called implied powers, that the government, let's go to implied powers, that it's not written down, but it's hinted at. To be implied is to not be written down, but to be hinted at. If I see you on the street and I go up to you and I say, ooh, are you all right? I'm implying that you don't look okay, you look tired, you look sick. Okay, that's the implication. I didn't say, are you tired, are you sick? But I implied it. And the necessary and proper clause implies that maybe the government can pass laws about things like health care. Next up is enumerated powers. This is the opposite of implied powers. These are written down and we know exactly what they are because they were listed in the Constitution, like the power to tax or the power to have a post office. These things are written down really clearly. You can't argue with them. You can't say that our government shouldn't be able to tax us. No, our founding fathers put it in the Constitution, and so there's no arguing with it. It's allowed to happen. Okay? Next up is federalism. Super top 5 important word to this class. Federalism is the sharing of power between the states and Washington, D.C., between the central government and the state governments. Anytime you deal with federalism in this class, I want you to make sure you're using the word sharing. And that means it's this cooperation between Washington, D.C. and the states, that we're working together and that we're not adversaries against each other. Okay? It also allows for us, so the states, to have power within their own realm. Like Like some states ban abortion today. Some states are okay with abortion. That's federalism. The fact that you can have 50 different states doing 50 different things. Some states have gambling. Some states ban gambling. Okay? And then we get kind of deeper into 3 different types of federalism. Dual federalism is this idea that it's really obvious, and this is kind of how we operated for the first 100 plus years of this country. It's really obvious what a state responsibility is and what the federal government's responsibility is. And back in the day, really the states did most of the stuff, and the federal government just had a post office, collected taxes, raised an army, kept us safe. And the states did most of the stuff, and really government in general did very little, where today the government's much more involved in your life. The next phase, maybe since the Great Depression, is more cooperative federalism, where the federal government and states are kind of working together to solve our problems. Some people, going back to dual, some people call this layer cake. Can you picture cake that has cake frosting? And it's really obvious, the differences between, oh, that's cake and that's frosting. And it was really obvious, oh, that's a state's job, that's a federal government's job. With cooperative federalism, the metaphor is more like marble cake. You know how it's all swirled together? And in that case, it becomes difficult when you say, people are hungry in California, or California has a homelessness problem, or the kids need to eat lunch at school. Should we make it free? It becomes murky, whose job is it to fix this problem? Should it be the federal government's job or the state's job? But either way, they might work together. An example of this would be, actually this fits down here. Since the 1980s, we've had this thing sort of like new federalism where especially Republican presidents, they want to give power back to the states. You see Trump say this, I want states to decide on abortion. I don't think the federal government should decide on abortion. And so it's restoring greater authority. It's kind of going back on cooperative and trying to return a little bit more to dual federalism. Yeah, I'll give you another example is school lunch program or food stamps. A lot of times the federal government under new federalism, they just give money to the state of Arizona and they say, you handle food stamps, here's the money, you run the program however you want to. Okay, next up is the Federalist Papers, and I hope you've heard of this before. When our founding fathers were writing the Constitution, they needed the 13 states to agree that they were okay with this new Constitution because it was going to be a drastic change in our government and how things were run. And so there was this period of time, months, maybe a year or so, in which they wrote the Constitution, but the men who wrote it had to return to their states and convince the states to vote yes on the Constitution. Sell it to the people, who I think each state's legislature had to vote yes on it. And 3 guys got together, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, and they wrote the Federalist Papers, which were semi-anonymous. I think they were in New York State, and they were written to try to convince the people of New York, but really today we look at it as trying to convince the country to vote yes on the Constitution, that it was a good idea, that and they wrote a lot of them. They wrote 85. And you know how sometimes we look at the Constitution and we have the elastic clause and we're like, what did they mean by that? The Federalist Papers are one of the best ways to see what they meant by some of the things they were writing, because they had to argue almost like a college essay and say here's the elastic clause is good because of this, and federalism is good because of this, and a House of Reps is good because of this. And it gives us an insight into their brain and what they meant when they wrote a lot of the Constitution. And in AP Gov, many of the many of our documents are Federalist Papers where they're explaining the president, the judicial branch, the Congress. All right. Next up is a formal amendment. An amendment is a change to the Constitution in this case. So over time, we have made changes to the Constitution and we're allowed to do that. It's really hard to do. It has only happened once in my lifetime, and it's not happened at all in your lifetime. And we've had lots of changes and amendments. Let's just say women's right to vote is the 19th Amendment. And so it took 2/3 of Congress and 2/3 of the states to vote yes on that change. And then we make a permanent change to the Constitution. And everybody has to respect it, the Supreme Court, the president, everybody. And it's semi-permanent. You can undo an amendment, but you're going to have to pass another amendment if you want to undo it. The opposite of that would be informal amendments, and these are like little changes over time. Like abortion has had many changes over time. We didn't pass an amendment to the Constitution about abortion, but like court cases have changed the way that we interpret abortion and whether or not we're okay with it. You know, first Roe v. Wade protected it, and then a couple years ago they kind of undid Roe v. Wade. Those types of changes are informal amendments. They're not permanent, and they're not real amendments to the Constitution, but they change kind of the meaning of how we interpret things. And the best example is court decisions. Brown v. Board undid segregation, for instance, but also laws count as this, and presidential actions can count as this too. I talked about implied powers. I talked about indirect democracy. Now we're on inherent powers. It's another type of power. I think maybe not. It's another type of power that is in the Constitution, and this is the one that's most forgotten. If you just pretend that inherent means obvious, then you'll understand. These are powers that are not written down, but they're obvious and nobody argues about it. Like, for instance, can America add new land? Can America do the Louisiana Purchase? Can America build a wall at the border if they want to? Yeah, they can, because it's obvious. Like, every country can do this. It doesn't need to be written down in the Constitution in order for it to be allowed. So inherent means obvious but not written down. All right, next up is judicial review. Super important word to government class, and this is the idea that judges can look at a law and decide whether they want to strike it down as unconstitutional. This is really the number one power that the judicial branch has. Let's look at an example. I guess the very first time they ever used it was in Margaret v. Madison, where they flexed their muscle and showed that they did have this power. But an easier example is Brown v. Board. So the South had a law that no white kids and no African American kids would be in the same classroom together, and the Supreme Court rightfully decided, we're putting a stop to that. We think that it's unconstitutional, that it violates people's equal protection rights, that the groups are not being treated equally, and thus that law needs to be struck down and gone. And that is them using the power of judicial review. Let's jump ahead to Marbury v. Madison, and essentially this is the very first court case, and I don't care that you remember the details of what happened, but it's the very first Supreme Court case where they did use the power of judicial review. And perhaps it's worth mentioning that judicial review was not written in the Constitution, and so we were kind of like, is this something we're allowed to do? I don't know. And by them doing it, it was like, oh yes, then I guess we can do it, because they just did it. And by the way, if you're like, are they allowed to do it? One of the ways that we know is because one of the Federalist Papers explained what the judicial branch should do, and that's a good example of why we like the Federalist Papers, because they gave us an explanation for things that were unclear in the Constitution. Next up is mandates, and a mandate is something that the national government, Washington, D.C., forces the states to do. All right? These are unpopular with the states because they don't like it, because they're being told what to do. An example of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a good law. I have no problem with it, but what it did was it forced the states to make sure, hey, every building has to have handicap access. Every building has to have a ramp for wheelchairs. Every building has to have an elevator. Every building has to have handicap parking spots. And while the idea of the law is good, the law said that states would have to pay for all the changes to the buildings. And so this was an unfunded mandate because the federal government is telling the states, make these changes, you have 5 years, and you have to pay for it. All right. Another famous court case is McCulloch v. Maryland. And in this court case, somebody wanted to get rid of the Bank of the United States. We created a bank, but the bank wasn't written down in the Constitution. So it's like, are we allowed to make a bank? And so I'm really simplifying the story here, but there was a lawsuit that tried to see, should the bank have a right to exist? And essentially, they used their power of judicial review, the judges, to say, yes, the bank has a right to exist because of the necessary and proper clause, because not everything's going to be written down in the Constitution. Some things are just implied, okay? And it verified that the necessary and proper clause is legit, and like the government has a right to do some things that are not word for word written in the Constitution. The next word is police powers, and it just is the ability of the states to protect public health, safety, morals, and the welfare of the public. And I mentioned to you that this is something that both the federal government has and states have. So it is a, what type of power? It is a concurrent power. Popular sovereignty just means that the power is with the people. Popular is people, sovereignty is power. The ultimate authority rests with the American people and what they want. Okay, next up is reserved powers, and a lot of times this is like a counter, like the sort of the opposite of the implied powers, where implied powers give the federal government this tremendous amount of power. Reserve powers give the states a lot of power, and they're also kind of unclear, like vague in a way. We're going to learn about it this unit, but the 10th Amendment, one of the whole point of the 10th Amendment says that any power that is not given to the federal government is reserved for the states. And so this is the amendment that gives states a tremendous amount of power, and maybe they might use this amendment to fight the federal government. Let's say on abortion, maybe they'll use the 10th Amendment to say we should be able to ban abortion in our state because we have reserve powers. So this is their like weapon that they get to have. Next up is separation of powers, and it's a lot like checks and balances. But essentially, we don't have all our power in one place. The Articles of Confederation, this was an issue because we had all our power in the Congress. But I mentioned the triangle of power earlier. We got in any order, it doesn't matter, but the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court or the judicial branch. We separated out the power. We didn't put it all in one place. We tried that with the king, and we didn't like the results. So we believe if there's power in one place, it'll lead to corruption and evilness. All right. Speaking of the Articles of Confederation, our first failed government, one of the things that showed it was a failure was Shays Rebellion, when a bunch of Massachusetts farmers rose up against the state of Massachusetts because all their farms were being foreclosed on. And it's kind of sad because I feel bad for the farmers, but they didn't have a way to, the national government at the time, which was the Articles, didn't have a way to put down the rebellion, although they did eventually figure it out. It scared them into saying, dang, we kind of need a stronger national government because this is going to be a problem when we run into big nationwide problems. How are we going to solve them? And so it kind of forced us to go back and do the Constitutional Convention and write the Constitution. Down here, supermajority, when I use this word in class, I'm just saying more than half. Like much more than half. So 51% is a simple majority. We call that a simple majority. A supermajority is any time in here where we say 2/3 or 3/4. In this class, we don't often see 3/5, but we do see 2/3 and we do see 3/4 sometimes, which is a really difficult number to achieve when like Congress is voting on something. Sometimes it'll be 2/3 of senators need to agree on a treaty. And so treaties are very rare in this country because that's a very hard number to get Democrats and Republicans to agree on. Or we'll see 3/4 because 3/4 of Congress needs to agree on something in order for it to become an amendment to the Constitution. Super difficult. That's why you guys haven't seen an amendment in your lifetime. And finally, the last one on here is unicameral legislature, which is the opposite of bicameral. It's a one-house legislature. Imagine if we only had a House of Reps and we didn't have a Senate, then we would have a unicameral legislature, but obviously we didn't do that. Maybe we should have, but that's a conversation for another day. Peace.